Ilara Vance was a ghost long before her husband died. She had drifted through the last years of his life like a phantom in her own home, a silent witness to the wasting sickness that had stolen his laughter, his strength, and finally, his breath. When he was gone, all that remained was the hollow echo of a life she no longer recognized and a secret so vast it felt more like a curse than a blessing, a fortune inherited from a father she barely knew, a shipping magnate from the East. She fled with that secret, seeking not a new life, but a place where her old one could be properly buried, a place so quiet and remote that no one would ever think to look for her. She was seeking an ending. But when her horse crested the final rise and she laid eyes on the town of Prosperity Creek, she saw that another fire had gotten there first. It was a town of skeletons, of blackened timbers clawing at a smoke-stained sky. The very air tasted of ash and finality. This, she thought with a grim sense of irony, was a place where things came to die. It was perfect. The townsfolk were gathered in what was once the town square, a miserable congregation of soot-streaked faces and slumped shoulders. They were listening to a man on a makeshift stage, a man whose clothes were too clean and whose smile was too sharp for a place so thoroughly broken. This was Silas Blackwood, a name she had heard whispered with a mix of fear and resentment in the last settlement she'd passed through. He owned the valley, they said, and everything in it. Now, he was picking at the bones of Prosperity Creek. He spoke of progress, of rebuilding, of a brighter future, but his words were poison-coated in sugar. He was offering to buy their worthless, charred plots for pennies on the dollar, a magnanimous gesture that felt more like a final nail in the town's coffin. His eyes, cold and dark as river stones, swept over the defeated crowd, drinking in their despair. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was one of total surrender. Then, one voice cut through the heavy air. "It's not worthless to us, Blackwood." The voice belonged to a young man lying on a cot near the front, his leg bound in crude, blood-stained splints. He was all sharp angles and defiant energy, a flame of resistance in a sea of embers. This was Caleb, a cowboy whose spirit was clearly more intact than his body. A wave of murmuring respect rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's smile tightened into a sneer. "Courage is a cheap commodity, son. It won't rebuild your homes or feed your children." He gestured to Caleb's shattered leg. "And it certainly won't mend that." He let the cruelty of his words hang in the air before continuing, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "What this town needs is capital. A miracle. Perhaps a marriage or two to consolidate what little is left." His gaze was predatory as he announced a perverse sort of auction, a way for the few remaining bachelors, including the injured Caleb, to be claimed by families in exchange for forgiving their debts. It was a public shaming disguised as charity, a final twist of the knife. Ilara watched, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She had come here to be invisible, to let her fortune lie dormant like a sleeping dragon. But as they prepared to humiliate the one man who still had some fight left in him, something inside her shifted. She saw in his fierce, helpless pride a reflection of her own caged grief. Protecting her secret had meant letting the world crumble around her. But what was the point of a fortune if it couldn't stand between a good man and his utter destruction? As Blackwood's man called Caleb's name, a wave of snickering rippled from Blackwood's cronies. Ilara took a breath, the taste of ash sharp on her tongue, and stepped forward. The crowd parted before her, a stranger in their midst. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried with the clear, ringing authority of a bell. "I will have him," she said, her eyes locked on Blackwood. "I will be his wife, and I will cover all his debts." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Blackwood's face was a mask of disbelief. Before he could object, Ilara reached into the small satchel at her waist and pulled out a single gold coin. She tossed it through the air, and it landed on the stage with a heavy, definitive clink that echoed across the silent square, silencing all doubt. It was more money than anyone in Prosperity Creek had seen in a year. "Is that enough for a start?" she asked, her gaze never leaving the stunned face of Silas Blackwood. Ilara's intervention had shattered the grim ceremony. She moved through the stunned silence to Caleb's side, ignoring the whispers and the open-mouthed stares. She knelt by his cot, her focus entirely on him and the town's weary doctor who was hovering nearby. "Can he be moved?" she asked, her voice low and steady. The doctor, a man named Elias Gable with eyes that had seen too much sorrow, nodded numbly. My office, what's left of it, is 2 streets over. With a nod, Ilara directed 2 of the stronger-looking men, offering them a silver piece each for their trouble. They hefted Caleb's cot with a gentleness that belied their rough appearance. As they carried him away, Caleb looked at Ilara, his face a mixture of pain, confusion, and raw, untamed pride. He didn't thank her. He didn't know what to say. He had been saved from humiliation by a ghost, a woman who had appeared from nowhere and purchased him like livestock. A short while later, in the doctor's miraculously intact office, Ilara paid for Caleb's treatment with another gold coin, instructing Dr. Gable to spare no expense. The doctor's hands trembled slightly as he took the money. "Me," he began, this is more than enough. This is more than she cut him off gently. Just see that he heals. Her generosity was a shield, but it was also a beacon, and she knew it would attract exactly the kind of attention she had spent a year avoiding. It didn't take long. That evening, as Ilara was clearing rubble from a small, partially standing cabin she had claimed on the edge of the ashes, Silas Blackwood appeared. He moved without a sound, his shadow falling over her before she heard his footsteps. "A woman of means," he said, his voice a silken threat. "And a woman of mystery." A dangerous combination in a place like this. Ilara did not stop her work, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. "I'm just a widow looking for a quiet life, Mr. Blackwood," he laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You've chosen a poor place for quiet, Mrs. Vance," she supplied, her voice flat. Ilara Vance Blackwood circled her, like a wolf sizing up its prey. "Tell me, Mrs. Vance. What brings a woman with gold in her purse to a town that has nothing left but ghosts?" He was probing, searching for a weakness. "You've made an interesting purchase in that cowboy. But you should know, everything in this valley passes through my hands eventually." Everything. He let the threat hang in the air, a promise of future conflict, before turning and disappearing back into the twilight. Ilara's hands trembled, but her resolve hardened. This man was not just a vulture, he was a predator. Over the next few days, as Caleb began a slow and painful recovery, Ilara focused on rebuilding the small cabin. It was hard, punishing work that left her body aching, but it quieted the noise in her head. While clearing a section of the floor that had been protected by a fallen wall, her shovel struck something metal. She dug around it and pulled out a heavy, soot-stained lockbox. The lock was melted shut, but she managed to pry it open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled amongst scorched papers, was a ledger. Much of it was destroyed, but one page was partially legible. It was a record of fuel purchases, barrels of oil, far more than a town this size would ever need, all delivered to a holding shed owned by Blackwood in the week leading up to the fire. A cold dread washed over her. This wasn't a tragedy. It was an attack. The fire had been deliberate. As this horrifying realization settled in, she looked up and saw one of Blackwood's men, a young man named Marcus, watching her from a distance. His face was a portrait of conflict, his eyes full of a guilt he couldn't hide. He knew. He knew what had happened. If you're enjoying this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what Ilara decided to do with this terrible knowledge would not only put her own life in danger but would determine the fate of everyone in Prosperity Creek. Ilara knew she couldn't confront Blackwood directly. She had one charred page from a ledger and the guilty face of a henchman. It was hardly enough to challenge a man who held the entire valley in his fist. Her first move was to trust. She took the ledger to Dr. Gable's office, where Caleb was now sitting up, his splintered leg propped on a stool. She laid the evidence on the table between them. "The fire wasn't an accident," she said simply. Caleb's eyes hardened, a flicker of the same defiant fire she'd seen in the town square. Dr. Gable, however, showed no surprise. He sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "I've suspected as much," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "The night of the fire, one of Blackwood's men came to me. A ranch hand named Jimmy. He had terrible burns on his arms and face. He was delirious with pain and kept muttering about the boss's orders and getting it done quick." The doctor looked at them, his old eyes filled with a new, dangerous resolve. "He died before dawn. Blackwood said it was a tragic accident. I knew he was lying in that moment. An alliance was forged in the quiet, antiseptic-smelling room. The widow with the secret fortune, the wounded cowboy, and the weary doctor. They were three against a tyrant, and they knew they were on their own. The law was a day's ride away, and the local sheriff was firmly in Blackwood's pocket. Their quiet rebellion did not go unnoticed. Blackwood, sensing a shift in the town's atmosphere from despair to defiance, began to squeeze. A wagon train carrying food and tools, paid for by the townsfolk's pooled resources, was turned back on the main road by Blackwood's armed riders for safety inspections. He was trying to starve them out, to break their spirits with hunger and isolation. He paid another visit to Ilara, this time dispensing with all pretense of civility. He found her outside her now habitable cabin, where Caleb was carefully sanding a piece of wood for a new door frame. Blackwood ignored Ilara and spoke directly to Caleb. "It's a shame about that leg," he said, his voice laced with menace. "A man with a bad leg is prone to accidents. Easy to trip and fall in a town with so much rubble. It would be a tragedy if your new wife became a widow." Again the threat was as clear as glass. He was threatening Caleb to control her. That was his mistake. He thought fear was her weakness, but he had just armed her with rage. The grieving, quiet woman was gone. In her place stood a protector, and she had a weapon far more powerful than his intimidation, her fortune. That night, she made a decision. She would no longer hide. She drafted a letter to a shipping and logistics company in a city 3 states away, a company her father had once owned a controlling interest in. She arranged for a massive caravan of 20 wagons, loaded with everything from lumber and nails to salted meat, flour, and medical supplies, to be dispatched to Prosperity Creek immediately. She paid for it all with a bank draft that would make a king weep, a sum so large it was its own declaration of war. A week later, the caravan arrived. It rolled into the valley like a conquering army of hope, guarded by a dozen armed men hired from the city. The people of Prosperity Creek wept at the sight of it. Blackwood's riders could only watch, impotent, as Ilara, standing on the lead wagon, directed the distribution of supplies. She had broken his siege and, in doing so, had become the town's undisputed leader. The people were no longer his victims, they were her army. Their new plan was audacious. They had to get the real ledgers, the ones that would prove Blackwood's crimes beyond any doubt. Caleb knew they were kept in a large iron safe in Blackwood's ranch house, a veritable fortress. Their only way in was Marcus, the conflicted henchman. Ilara sought him out, finding him watering his horse by the creek. She didn't threaten him. She offered him a future. "I know you're a good man, Marcus," she said softly. "I've seen it in your eyes. Blackwood will burn you just as he burned this town the moment you are no longer useful to him. I am offering you another choice. Help us, and I will give you and your family enough money to start a new life, anywhere you want to go. Far from here." Far from him, she looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "He is asking you to be a monster. I am asking you to be a hero. What kind of man do you want to be?" Marcus stared at his reflection in the water for a long moment, then looked up at her, his eyes full of a terrible, liberating decision. "What do you need me to do?" The night they chose was dark and moonless, with the heavy scent of rain on the wind. A storm was coming, a fitting backdrop for the tempest they were about to unleash. True to his word, Marcus had arranged the guard patrols at the Blackwood Ranch to leave a blind spot on the western fence for a crucial 15-minute window. Dr. Gable, meanwhile, started a small, controlled blaze in a derelict barn on the far side of town, a brilliant diversion that sent the bulk of Blackwood's men racing towards the smoke. Under the cover of the chaos, Ilara and Caleb slipped through the fence. Caleb, leaning heavily on a masterfully carved crutch, moved with a grim determination, his knowledge of the ranch's layout guiding them through the shadows. The house was an obscene monument to wealth and power, looming dark against the churning sky. They entered through a pantry window that Marcus had left unlatched. The air inside was thick with the smell of leather and cigar smoke. They found the study easily. And there it was, a massive iron safe, squat and malevolent, set into the far wall. As Caleb began to work on the combination, a skill he'd sheepishly admitted to learning in his misspent youth, a floorboard creaked behind them. They spun around. Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway, a smug, triumphant grin on his face, a gleaming rifle cradled in his arms. And beside him, looking pale and terrified, stood Marcus. "Did you really think," Blackwood savored the words, "that you could fool me in my own home? My own town?" He nudged Marcus forward with the barrel of the rifle. "My boy Marcus here told me everything. Loyalty, you see, is something your money can't buy." Blackwood's eyes glittered with pure, unadulterated malice. He felt untouchable, omnipotent. He began to pace, his confession flowing from him like poison from a wound. He admitted to it all, the scheme, the arson, the cold-blooded murder of his own man, Jimmy, to silence him. "This valley should have been mine from the start," he snarled, his voice thick with greed. "People are an inconvenience. They're ants on the landscape. And sometimes, you have to burn the ant hill to clear the path for something greater." He stopped pacing and leveled the rifle, its dark eye fixing on Caleb. "And you," he spat, "are the most inconvenient of them all. I'll start by taking care of your little pet cowboy, Mrs. Vance." The click of the hammer being pulled back was deafening in the silent room. But just as his finger tightened on the trigger, Marcus lunged. It wasn't a heroic tackle, but a desperate, clumsy shove. It was enough. The rifle roared, the shot going wide and splintering the wooden desk. "I'm not one of your ants!" Marcus screamed, his face a mask of terror and defiance. Blackwood, enraged, slammed the butt of his rifle into Marcus's side, sending him crumpling to the floor. In that split second of distraction, Caleb moved. Ignoring the searing pain in his leg, he launched himself forward, not at Blackwood, but at his legs. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Blackwood was stronger, his fists like hammers, but Caleb clung on with fierce desperation. Ilara, her fear burned away by a white-hot fury, grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a thick iron poker from the hearth. She hefted it, its weight both terrifying and reassuring. Blackwood threw Caleb off and scrambled for his rifle. He got to his feet just as Ilara stepped between him and Caleb, the poker held before her like a sword. "It's over, Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. He laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "It's over when I say it is. You're nothing but a woman with a fireplace tool." He raised the rifle to his shoulder. But as he did, the grand double doors of the study burst open. Standing there, silhouetted against the stormy night, was Dr. Gable. And behind him stood the men and women of Prosperity Creek. They were armed not with rifles, but with hammers, axes, pitchforks, and a silent, collective rage that was more terrifying than any army. They had seen the diversion for what it was and heard the gunshot. They had come for their own. The smug certainty on Silas Blackwood's face finally crumbled, replaced by the stark, primal shock of a predator who has suddenly found itself surrounded by the herd. He was trapped. What would you do if you were in Ilara's shoes? Would you demand swift justice, or something more? Tell us what you think in the comments below. The standoff in the study was a silent tableau of reckoning. Blackwood, surrounded and disarmed, saw the end of his reign not in the barrel of a gun, but in the dozens of weary, resolute faces that filled the doorway. There was no wild cry for vengeance, no surge of mob violence. The people of Prosperity Creek, led by Ilara's quiet strength, had found a courage that didn't need to be loud. They bound Blackwood with rope from his own stables and waited. Ilara, using the vast network her father's business had afforded her, had done more than just order supplies. She had sent a wire to the territorial capital, requesting the presence of a federal marshal, along with a detailed account of her suspicions. 2 days later, the marshal arrived, a stern, impartial man who was immune to Blackwood's local influence. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledgers from the safe, combined with Marcus's full confession and Dr. Gable's testimony about the dying ranch hand, painted a damning picture of greed, arson, and murder. Silas Blackwood was tried in a federal court, far from the reach of his cronies. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to spend the rest of his miserable life in a federal prison, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered across the territory. His vast landholdings were seized and, in an act of poetic justice, were offered first to the citizens of Prosperity Creek, who bought back their family plots with fair loans secured by a fund Ilara quietly established. Justice had been served, but mercy had its place as well. For his testimony, Marcus was given a full pardon. True to her word, Ilara provided him and his family with a generous sum, enough to buy a small farm in a distant state where the name Blackwood meant nothing, giving him the one thing he craved, an honest new beginning. Dr. Gable, by unanimous vote, was elected the first mayor of the newly chartered town, his wisdom and compassion becoming the bedrock of their new government. The town of Prosperity Creek rose from its own ashes, stronger and more vibrant than before. Ilara's fortune, once a source of fear and isolation, became a river of life for the community. She funded the construction of a new schoolhouse, a sturdy church with a tall white steeple, and a town hall built from the finest lumber. The money was the tool, but the will of the people was the force that rebuilt the town. It was no longer just a place on a map, it was a testament to their resilience. Months melted into a year. The raw scent of cut pine and fresh paint replaced the stale smell of ash. Laughter once again echoed in the streets. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ilara stood on the porch of the home she now shared with Caleb. It was the same cabin she had first claimed, now expanded and reinforced, with a porch swing he had built with his own hands. His leg had healed, leaving him with a slight, dignified limp that only added to his quiet strength. He was no longer the broken man on the cot, but her husband, her partner, her equal in every way. He came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. They watched as the lights in the schoolhouse went out and families strolled home, their voices carrying on the gentle evening air. "You know," Caleb said softly, his voice full of a warmth that always made her feel safe, "when you tossed that gold coin, I thought you were just buying a man's pride." He turned her to face him, his eyes full of a deep and abiding love. "But you weren't buying anything. You were investing." In all of us, Ilara leaned her head against his chest, the steady beat of his heart a comforting rhythm. The ghost of her past was finally laid to rest, replaced by a profound and grounding peace. "No," she whispered, a smile touching her lips. "We invested." Together the secret fortune had led her to a place of ruin, but it was courage that had cleared the land, and it was love that had finally, truly, built a home. The story of Prosperity Creek was far from over. To see how Ilara and Caleb face a new threat from a powerful railroad company, click on the video that is now appearing on your screen. And as always, thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and hope.